Thank you again.
Oh, that was an amazing way to start our day. That was exceptional. I really only have the formal duty of confirming that we have a quorum here to start today's proceedings, and it's quite clear that we do. Thank you all for being here for that first session. I'll now hand back to the Chair to introduce the first session.
Thank you, Anne. So our first session, and I introduce the Chair, our President, Michael Gannon. The policy session is Healthcare in Danger. The Coordinator, Dr. Kate Stockhausen. Welcome to the Chair. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for the players. That was a moving presentation. And thank you to Associate Professor Susan Newhouse for her part in that presentation. I'm honoured now to introduce Ms Natalia Wells, Policy and Political Affairs Officer at the Australian Mission of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. The ICRC is an impartial, neutral and independent organisation whose exclusively humanitarian mission is to protect the lives and dignity of victims of armed conflict and other situations of violence, and to provide them with assistance. The provision of physical and psychosocial health care, medical supplies, medical training, including first aid training and war trauma surgery, healthcare facilities and prostheses is a large part of the ICRC's work. Despite the Geneva Conventions and other relevant humanitarian international laws that aim to protect healthcare personnel, healthcare workers and facilities continue to be attacked in armed conflicts throughout the world. The ICRC itself has reported 2,398 incidents of violence against healthcare workers in armed conflicts and other emergencies in 11 countries between January 2012 and December 2014. Natalia is here to present the ICRC's Healthcare in Danger project. The project endeavours to highlight and confront the issue of violence against patients, healthcare workers, facilities and vehicles, and ensure safe access to and delivery of healthcare in armed conflict and other emergencies. Delegates and guests will have the opportunity to ask questions following the presentation, but first of all, I'd like you to welcome to the stage Natalia Wells.
Well, talk about a hard act to follow. Thank you very much. That was really, really wonderful and very moving. And thanks to all of you for coming early in the morning to hear me speak. When I was thinking about my presentation here today, I thought back to my time quite a long time ago, last decade in fact, when I was in Syria. I was studying and living there. Not quite as long as some of the memories that we witnessed this morning. I had amoebic dysentery. So naturally I thought I was dying, and I went to the nearest hospital. And it was a lovely place run by some nuns. They gave me a blood test and prescribed antibiotics. And I was young and foolish, so I probably didn't finish the course and contributed to the antibiotic situation. And I wonder whether that building is still standing. I'm not sure. It's in the middle of Damascus. But I certainly wonder if the nuns are still there and if any medical workers are still there. We all know that the war in Syria has devastated much of the country's services, including the healthcare system. And we've all seen the photos of the hospitals that have been destroyed. We've seen pictures of patients lying on the floor of makeshift theatres. So I won't bombard you today with those sorts of photos. But I use Syria as an unfortunate example, a classic example of war raged in densely populated areas, in urban areas. The humanitarian effects are profound and far-reaching. And just when healthcare services are so critical, they are caught up in the middle of fighting and are vulnerable to attack. I'm not sure I can get the slides to move. Anyway, good. In armed conflicts, safe access to healthcare is often amongst the first casualties. The sick and the wounded cannot get to hospitals or get the medical attention that they need for a number of reasons. They may not be able to travel freely because of the fighting. They may have to cross front lines. There may be snipers. Ambulances that should collect them can't because they're held up at checkpoints or they've been bombed out of commission. Even if they make it to a healthcare facility, they may be damaged or even destroyed, or there may be no medicines available in them. And health personnel who should be able to attend to them may have been forced to flee, they may have been arrested, they may have been killed. What we call healthcare in danger, the violence against healthcare, attacks against healthcare, and obstructions to access to healthcare, is a significant humanitarian issue, has widespread and long-term effects. In some cases, such as in Syria and Yemen, it can sometimes lead to the entire collapse of a health system. And it's literally a matter of life and death. Just quickly, I'll give you some background on the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, for those who are not aware. We are an impartial, neutral, and independent organisation. We have an exclusively humanitarian mission, which is to protect the lives and dignity of victims of war and internal violence, and to provide them with assistance. The assistance that we provide is in accordance with the needs of the population who are affected. But as you can imagine, health services are very often a significant need. The ICRC is the guardian of the Geneva Conventions, and these mandate us to protect and assist victims of war, but also to promote international humanitarian law, IHL, or the rules of law, the laws of war. The ICRC is also part of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, which I'll refer to as the movement. This comprises as well all the national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies around the world, who every day are aiding their government in providing assistance in disasters and conflict. And the peak body for these national societies, the International Federation of the Red Cross. So in our work around the world with our partners, the ICRC has witnessed many attacks against healthcare or inability for people to receive the treatment that they require. And what we have witnessed, we would say, falls roughly into 4 categories. We've witnessed attacks on medical facilities, hospitals, clinics, etc., first aid posts. These attacks can be both deliberate and accidental. The violence against facilities can also include pillaging and looting. So the hospitals might still be standing, but unfortunately not have anything to provide. A second category are the wounded and the sick themselves. In this image, a police commander was being transported to hospital in an ambulance, but the ambulance was pulled aside, he was removed and executed before he could receive the treatment that he required. So this occurs to people when they're trying to get to hospital, when ambulances, for example. I've mentioned snipers, people who have risked their lives and injury to get to hospital, and of course, in hospital. And we've witnessed attacks against healthcare personnel. Here's a doctor in Libya who's crying for his colleagues who were killed in an airstrike. Again, these attacks can be deliberate, but also accidental, when military targets are close by to hospitals and they've missed. And threats don't even have to be, the attacks don't even have to be realised. Threats of arrest or violence or death is enough to make many health professionals think twice about going into work. There's a fourth access which is similar to the others, but the ICRC has seen enough to consider it a category in its own, which is medical vehicles, ambulances and the like. They're also attacked deliberately or unintentionally, but in addition there are delays. So often, even if the resources are there, the ambulances are there, medicines are there, sometimes they're delayed at checkpoints so that they're not of any assistance by the time they arrive. These, of course, are all in violation of international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law provides that all healthcare facilities and healthcare personnel shall be respected and protected at all times and shall not be the subject of attack. There are exceptions, of course, and healthcare facilities and personnel can lose their protection if they commit acts harmful to the enemy. And some examples would be using the healthcare facility to shelter able-bodied combatants pretending to be wounded, storing ammunition, being an observation post for militaries, providing information, acting as a shield for military action, or in fact, taking up arms and fighting for one side or the other. In 2008, the ICRC decided it would be best to start collecting data on incidents of attacks against healthcare to establish an evidence base. The first report was published in 2011, and it gathered incidents that the ICRC witnessed itself or was able to gain reports from in 16 countries, unidentified countries. And this was followed up with a study of 11 countries over 3 years, which was published in 2015. These 11 countries out of the 16 were locations that ICRC was able to consistently look for data over those 3 years. I'm probably going to skip ahead 2 slides now. This report found that more than 4,200 people had been victims of violence against healthcare in those 11 countries. I'd like to stress that these are what we call direct attacks, attacks where we can see the consequences to the victims. What is much more difficult to measure are the knock-on effects. So, for example, it's clear when someone arrives too late at a hospital because of a delay at a checkpoint. But what is more difficult to measure are things such as people who do not receive treatment at hospitals, who don't even go because there are no hospitals in that area left. People who succumb to chronic diseases or chronic illnesses because there are no medicines anymore. Or children who are born in places where vaccination programs have been suspended and who die from diseases that can be prevented through immunization. So I have a few slides breaking down the data in terms of where these incidents happen most frequently. As you can see, more than half occur in healthcare facilities or around them. Also some, as I mentioned, at checkpoints, quite a few on the road and in public space. But again, what is not measured are the knock-on effects of these incidents. If a hospital becomes perceived as a dangerous place, as a place where they will not receive treatment because maybe they witness routinely that armed forces or armed groups enter and search the hospital, and every second day they see someone being pulled out and arrested, the perception that it's not a safe place to go for treatment means that people who need medical attention may decide not to go. And in terms of healthcare workers who are affected by violence, and this can be physical attacks, it can be threats of violence, threats of arrest, etc. The bulk of healthcare personnel who are affected, not surprisingly, are the local healthcare providers, 90%. So although media attention may, in places like Australia, focus more on international aid workers who go overseas and are caught up in conflict, it's the local healthcare providers who are literally on the front line. We also tried to have a look at who is committing these acts. The data from this study is quite consistent with previous studies of data that was collected by the ICRC. And it shows that the proportion of attacks by state armed forces, otherwise militaries, is on par with non-state armed groups. There may be differences here in terms of deliberate attacks versus accidental attacks. But the effects on a hospital that has been damaged or medical personnel who have been killed are the same, whether it was deliberate or accidental. So, what are we doing about this? Healthcare in Danger is the name given to the project that the ICRC is leading with the entire Red Cross Red Crescent movement. It was launched in 2011. It first raises awareness of the problem based on the data that was gathered in the ICRC reports. Then the project sought to find solutions, practical measures, to assist with every aspect of the problem. And this related to things such as the physical safety of hospitals, the safety and preparedness of healthcare personnel, emergency responders, including National Society staff, also the safety and preparedness of ambulances. And of course, given the nature of conflict, the project had a look at armed forces and non-state armed groups to look at measures that could be taken to improve the safety of healthcare provision. Consultations were held over a 2-year period around the globe with experts, including in Australia. In 2013, Australia co-hosted with the ICRC a workshop on military operational practices and gathered representatives from 27 militaries around the world who had on-the-ground experience and knowledge of how to deal with situations in military operations without affecting the access to healthcare. All in all, over 500 members of the movement and health workers, government officials, armed groups, humanitarian organisations, members of civil society participated in the project to formulate practical recommendations to improve the safety of healthcare. Here I have an example of some recommendations for states. In addition to recommendations that were made for hospital architects and administrators, for armed forces and armed groups, for healthcare personnel and other responders, and ambulance services. The first one for states, improving legal protection for both patients and health workers, is very important. Healthcare professionals need to be able to conduct their duties in line with their medical ethics. And they should not be punished for doing so. This needs to be supported through domestic legislation from the countries that healthcare professionals are working in or come from. It's also a requirement for states to promote awareness of and compliance with international humanitarian law among the general public and the armed forces. And something that the ICRC did find quite difficult throughout this process was the lack of data on healthcare attacks, the lack of systematic and consistent data. And states have a role to play in ensuring that data is collected in a consistent manner and analysed. And of course, there do need to be sanctions. Attacks on healthcare should not go unpunished and need mechanisms for investigations. So the Healthcare in Danger project has now outgrown the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. There are multiple stakeholders, and we have established what we call a community of concern. This is a catalyst for change that supports, at various levels, the implementation of the recommendations and measures to improve and protect healthcare that came out of the workshops. It's made up of health professionals like yourselves, governments, people who bear arms, civil society representatives, international organisations, and more. The community of concern includes key partners such as the International Federation of Medical Students Associations, International Council of Nurses, the International Committee for Military Medicine, and also the World Medical Association. The World Medical Association is a close partner of the Healthcare in Danger initiative, and through its member associations such as the AMA, it works to protect healthcare professionals and promote respect for medical ethics at the national and international level. And as I'm sure you're aware, the WMA also works with other partners to raise awareness of threats to healthcare services and to find solutions. The WMA has issued regulations in times of armed conflict and other situations of violence, which has been adopted by the AMA in 2013. And these have been echoed in what we call the ethical principles of healthcare in times of armed conflict or emergencies. A copy of this is in your conference satchel. This is an agreement or a code of ethics by global bodies, the WMA, the International Council of Nurses, the International Committee for Military Medicine, and the International Federation of Pharmaceuticals. It is designed to be a tool to assist healthcare personnel in negotiating with various authorities. It's encapsulated in General Principle Number 3, which states that the primary task of healthcare personnel is to preserve people's physical and mental health and to alleviate suffering. They shall provide the necessary care with humanity, while respecting the dignity of the persons concerned, with no discrimination of any kind, whether in times of peace or armed conflict or other emergencies. Medical ethics, as I'm sure you're aware, are extremely important in peacetime and in conflict. Upholding medical ethics protects both patients and health workers. Patients receive the care they need without prejudice or discrimination. They're not ill-treated or ignored or turned away from assistance because of their status as the enemy or the opposition or collaborator or terrorist or any other label that might be applied. And healthcare personnel who know their right to act in accordance with medical ethics, no matter the situation, have a greater ability to stand up to any coercion or orders to act unethically. And these two sides of the coin are inextricably linked, because it's through the provision of impartial humanitarian medical care that the protection of healthcare personnel is reinforced and respected. When all sides to a conflict and all civilians know that they can access healthcare when they need it because Hospital X or Hospital Y provides impartial care, everyone is more likely to respect the facility and the staff. We in the movement are very happy to see our work, as well as the work of other organisations such as MSF and WHO, to see this work manifested in global commitments. For example, the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, which all states parties to the Geneva Conventions attend, adopted a resolution in December 2015 to promote the recommendations of the Healthcare in Danger project. And this time last year, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 2286. These resolutions endorse recommendations developed in the framework of the Healthcare in Danger initiative, and they urge states and other actors to implement a series of measures for the protection of healthcare. So what can the AMA do? I'm glad you asked. The Healthcare in Danger project, of course, has recommendations for medical workers. Sorry. No, it's not going back. They're making sure that medical workers know their rights and responsibilities in peacetime and also in times of conflict. Increasing everyone's awareness of the ethical principles of healthcare in times of armed conflict. Adopting protocols and plans for the safety and security of healthcare personnel, facilities and vehicles. Having attention to the duty of care. Also incorporating international law that protects health services and the rights and responsibilities of medical workers in training and education. And urging governments to enact or comply with laws. The AMA, as the peak national medical body, is in a perfect position to assist and to lobby the government to act on its commitments through its policies, through resolutions of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Conference, also its commitments in binding resolutions of the UN Security Council. The AMA could work with other national peak bodies that have an interest in the issue, such as nurses' associations or pharmacists, or the Australian Medical Students Association. An area that the ICRC particularly has a key role to play in Australia is to ensure the education of future healthcare professionals who will work here and overseas in their rights and responsibilities and medical ethics. For example, raising the issue at a national forum. I think Kate has ticked the box. Disseminating the ethical guidelines or the WMA regulations consistently. Ensuring that health workers, particularly those who deploy overseas in areas of conflict or disasters, receive the training that they require, especially in medical ethics, perhaps role-playing scenarios of medical quandaries that they may face. There are many organisations that provide training and other sorts of programs for humanitarian practitioners. Organisations such as the Australian Red Cross, Red R, for example. And of course, including medical ethics and international law in university medical courses. For example, inviting someone from ICRC or the Australian Red Cross to speak to students. Also, there's a wealth of resources on the healthcareindanger.org website, including a self-guided online course on the rights and responsibilities of healthcare personnel in armed conflict and emergencies, designed for students. This is based on the book of the same name, which is also available as a free PDF download. To conclude, I'm going to go back to Syria. And one of the reasons I mentioned Syria before the war is these days, with the relentless media coverage of war-torn Syria, it's easy to think that Syria has always been a conflict hotspot. But it hasn't. When I was at that hospital for the amoeba, no one had any inkling that the future held a devastating civil war, that Syrian neighbours would be pitted against each other, that people would differentiate between civilians and patients depending on their religion or who they supported. So if you're wondering whether healthcare in danger is relevant in Australia, I would say to you, I don't think the Syrian health professionals thought so until about 2011. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Hi, Chris Morgan. I'm the chair of the Ethics and Recovery Committee. Look, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's really, maybe a talk like this actually at a conference like this puts into perspective the sort of daily gripes that we have. Maybe the values of your colleagues actually remind us of what we all become doctors for.
Thank you.
A question which is practical, which I'm always kind of interested in, is the possibility that healthcare workers and sites are actually used as pawns in a conflict. And I'm interested in, the potential for them to be targeted specifically, and then it becomes a, and I don't want to be sexist, but he said, she said type situation about who targeted it and the other person that's made to look like the bad party. I'm interested how, apart from, a big crescent or cross on the site and marks on individuals, how you can, apart from physically and other ways, define the healthcare workers so that they are identified, not only to the warring parties, but potentially also to, a neutral party, so that it's very clear that you're healthcare workers.
Certainly. Thank you very much for the question. And you're absolutely right. It's unfortunate that there are deliberate attacks. And when I was speaking before about the importance of upholding medical ethics as being part of the protection for healthcare workers, is that in the slightest violation or perception of a violation of medical ethics can feed into a narrative that certain groups or certain sides may like to use for their purposes, which are usually not good purposes. In other words, trying to justify attacks. But of course, there is no justification in attacking healthcare workers. In terms of identification, yes, certainly there are protective emblems such as the Red Cross or Red Crescent. One thing that is important, depending on the context, but in certain situations, healthcare workers themselves, when they're being deployed to a hospital or a particular area, may not be completely aware of the security assessments that are undertaken prior to setting up a hospital. But a lot of work goes into that assessment, into whether it is actually safe to have a hospital in that area or to work in such an area. And it involves dialogue with all the parties involved. That's tricky because sometimes the parties involved change or the territory changes, but it's extremely important to have dialogue with the authorities and also the warring parties. So as an example, the ICRC also provides GPS coordinates of its facilities to parties in its negotiating respect for that area. Another thing is for ambulances. Rather than just relying on the fact that ambulances are protected and going from A to B and hoping against hope that people are going to respect the laws, it's important to negotiate where possible. Obviously in emergencies it's a bit difficult, but in terms of negotiating access through checkpoints in advance, of saying this doctor needs to transport a patient through this particular road, who's going to be at that checkpoint? Do they know that we're going to be there? Can you please make sure that they're aware that we're coming through, etc. So there are some other ways that can be done, but are not necessarily the responsibility of healthcare personnel themselves. Yeah.
Sorry? I forgot
Yeah.
it close, sorry.
Yeah.
Natalia, thank you for your talk. I think, sorry, Professor Sankamitra here. The awareness and your advocacy needs to be widely disseminated in the press, obviously. In terms of awareness and compliance with international law to protect healthcare workers in war zones, my only point was that with regards to raising awareness about the Geneva Conventions and the rights of health workers among the general public and states, whether we need a more focused approach, particularly when talking about the general public, whether we need to raise awareness among sections of the public who are more likely to be radicalized, and among states like which organize sort of mass killing of their own citizens. So say President Assad's regime, armed forces might need to have a sort of awareness program about this.
Yes, thank you very much. That's certainly a huge part of ICRC's work, and also the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies who do have a role to play in educating, in providing assistance in the education of IHL to their armed forces and to governments as well. You're absolutely right. It's a tougher battle in some places than others, but it is extremely important that there is awareness. It's not necessary for everyone to be an expert. I'm certainly not a legal expert, but to understand the principles behind the laws of war, absolutely. And I think we see this in media in Australia, where some of the misassumptions or misunderstandings do play out in people's opinion of how and why war is being waged. But it is something that is part of our daily work, and it's continual. It's not enough to speak to, for example, a state's armed forces once a year, because there are new cohorts coming through every year. It's something that needs to be done again and again, so that the future leaders in the military are aware, but also new recruits who come in. So it is a never-ending battle. Thank you.
Just to explain your situation locally, I was in Syria early 1990 with some diplomatic people. It was made very clear then that The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The friend of my enemy, that is those who packed him up, is my enemy. It's a completely different culture to what we have here, and that is why you're having problems.
Thank you.
Just briefly, I'm curious to know training for healthcare providers who are operating in conflict zones. What effort and investment is in that space?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Training for healthcare providers who operate in conflict zones, especially now with fly-in, fly-out contractors who do a lot of this work. What training and support is available through your group?
Is available,
yeah.
Yep. Certainly. So as I mentioned, the Australian Red Cross provides quite a few training courses in various states and territories. MSF provides comprehensive training for its employees who deploy. There's organisations such as Red R that specialise in providing training and preparedness for people who deploy overseas in humanitarian contexts. There are also quite a few resources available online that can be used individually or in educational settings, for example. But it is something that we've seen in many countries, including Australia, is an important gap. As I said before, healthcare personnel don't necessarily have to be legal experts at all, and they don't need to be completely responsible or aware of the security assessments behind their workplaces. But it's important to know the basics of their legal protections and the legal frameworks that they're working in. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to thank Natalia for that excellent session. I think Chris raised an important point there about some of the things we talk about. This is real medicine at its heart. Yesterday I spoke to our international guest from Thailand and asked him to reflect on the deep engagement of our political leaders. They're not talking a great deal about freezers in Thailand with the military government in charge. And one of the pleasures I get in my job is to, through the World Medical Association and also through the Confederation in the Asia Pacific region, is to talk about these issues. And I would encourage you all to have a look at the WMA statements on this very issue, updated as recently as last year. This is such important work, and it's these tragedies are very real. But I think, Natalia, your presentation was excellent, refocusing us in this room on what really matters in healthcare, ethical medical practice, and thinking about those brave people who put their own lives at risk just doing their job every day. This is medical care at its purest. So I'd like you all to join me again in thanking Natalia Wells for her excellent presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Our next session is the AMSA President's Address, this year given by Rob Thomas. So Rob is a Brisbane-based medical student. He's passionate about the profession of medicine. This year he's deferred his medical studies so he can contribute all his energies to his role as President of AMSA. Prior to this, he'd been busy not only with AMSA but with the University of Queensland Medical Society. Rob's particular interests include the quality and regulation of medical education in Australia in a period where medical knowledge and information grows on a daily basis, and in his spare time he coaches high school rowing and volunteers at the Cure Brain Cancer Foundation. Welcome, Rob.
Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. As we've already heard at this conference, this week is an important anniversary of the recognition of Indigenous Australians. and the equality and health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continues to be one of our greatest goals in collaboration with the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association. So as you heard, my name is Rob. This is my very first national conference, and I have the great honour of representing more than 17,000 young people across now 21 medical schools around Australia. I sincerely thank the AMA again for having AMSA as part of this agenda-setting conference and in their continued efforts to listen to and advocate for the future of the health profession. When I left high school, I was determined to become a doctor as fast as possible. I'd been accepted into the University of Queensland guaranteed postgraduate pathway, largely because the accelerated program would get me there more quickly. I wanted to rush through my undergrad. It pained me to dedicate hours to the study of subjects I couldn't relate to this vision of my future, always looking ahead to the clinical environment. My future was defined by medicine. I would be a doctor, work as part of a team, and make people's lives better by virtue of this fact. I found myself drawn to people who also happened to be headed towards medicine and whose aspirations matched mine. How little did we know. Looking back, I should never have thought of the undergraduate period of my life as merely a delay to my journey into medicine. It was foundational, not only in content, but also in life experience. We are granted so many opportunities within medicine, but sometimes our overwhelming passion has the effect of doing just that, overwhelming us. For myself, as well as many of my peers, medicine isn't just about treating patients, but about healing people in the broadest sense, being an advocate, a champion for change, and this is an ambition that helps medical leadership to flourish. Earlier this week, I spent 5 days in Canberra with 100 ambitious, engaged, thoughtful medical students at our National Leadership Development Seminar. It reinforced what I love about AMSA, a unique organisation of young people with irrepressible enthusiasm. Together, we spoke of how to address some of the largest health issues the world faces, like climate change, refugees, and the complex problems of mental health in medicine. Not only would we seek to cure our patients, but to fix the reasons that they are sick and the structures that perpetuate it. Back in November, I read a popular article by an ED physician who received backlash for describing medicine as just a job. In it, he explained that his investment in medicine stopped when he left the hospital, allowing him the necessary time to restore and prevent his own burnout. While I'm not sure that many would agree that medicine is just a job, he raised an interesting question around the ability for doctors to at times distance themselves from their all-encompassing careers. In a way, I really admire his ability to step out of the role when his shift ends, and it's certainly a protective skill that prevents us from taking every adverse event to heart. And there are many reasons why treating medicine as just a job seems like a great idea. Your ability to preserve an empathic approach to patients may be increased. Your relationships with family and friends may improve. You may be better able to cope with challenging patient experiences. When we strive for positive change and become a strong advocate for our patients, we inevitably take parts of their experiences with us. In medicine, patients let each and every one of us into a privileged position in their lives. It's incredible how many patients will open up about their lives, their fears and their hopes, and allow us into such an intimate situation. We are the ones who are there at some of the most vulnerable points in a person's life. With this privilege comes responsibility, and it's not without burden. Every single person in this room is aware of the problem our profession faces with mental illness, and it's the reason that many AMSA presidents before me have chosen to speak to this issue as they gave this address. According to the World Health Organization, depression is now the leading cause of disability worldwide. This year, we've had tragic reminders of the struggles doctors experience and it's not something I want our profession to be known for. I don't know the answer. I don't know what reasons there were for the suicides, but I know we need a change. I sometimes wonder if medical students and junior doctors are set up to fail. Increasingly, the emphasis is on competition. It's on being able to tackle the vast amount of medical knowledge that's transforming every day. Although we talk about work-life balance, the system rewards us only for working harder. Like myself in undergrad, we're always looking forward, always giving up our time. We hear stories of fantastic individuals who seem to juggle it all, but for many, this isn't possible. Not only is absolute dedication idealised, it's become a new frame of reference for young people trying to balance adulthood. While I recognise that pushing the boundaries leads to advancement of medical knowledge, students need to learn how to do this safely. Another issue that has permeated my experience at AMSA is the scope of an organisation such as ours. I'm surprised and encouraged by the diversity of my student cohort, not only in background, but in opinions as well. However, these diverse opinions can lead to intense debate, which can be hard to grapple with at times. This issue is so prevalent that scope has become a dirty word in our council discussions. Many, myself included, have been of the opinion that our primary focus should be on those issues that affect our education and our clinical practice. While these are and should remain important to us, there is a vast array of issues that influence health in an even broader sense. The Australian Medical Council intern outcome statements has a whole domain on the intern as being an effective health advocate, recognising that our scope extends well beyond the hospital doors. In a world of post-truth, fake news and anti-vaxxers, I suspect the medical profession needs to embrace our standing as a source of expertise and seek to expand our scope. When we push for internships for all graduates of Australian medical schools, we are fighting for our future. But when we campaign for marriage equality, climate change legislation, and refugee health, we are not only advocating for ourselves, but also for our patients, and more broadly, the world we live in. Advocating for these other issues says that we are more than just self-interested youth, and that this concern for others is central to who we are. In our generation, we're often told that we live in a world of incredible innovation and change. While innovations are often welcome, the relentless pace of economic change driven by technology is creating massive upheavals in the job market. Increasing casualisation of the workforce, job substitution, and other trends mean that our futures are more and more uncertain. This issue is extensively discussed by economists, and I don't make any pretensions to be an expert in it. However, as young people are on the cusp of their careers, these trends will affect us. They will also have a large effect on medical practice in general, ranging from young people not being able to afford private health insurance to the question of whether some specialties will be around in 20 years' time. This insecurity is something we'll learn to be comfortable in. To deal with these changes, resilience is needed now more than ever. Now, resilience isn't merely being taught to harden up. It involves protective self-care practice and should become a part of all levels of teaching. However, it's only one step in fixing the problem, where the system may actually be at fault. The effect doctors have on their students perhaps goes unnoticed day to day. Students model themselves on the people they see around them in the hospital. Beyond just medical knowledge, staff influence what we understand as normal professional practice. One example I think about is from my surgical term last year. I remember clearly my PHO coming into the hospital one morning, clearly unwell. I suspect it was influenza, but I don't want to get it wrong in a room like this. I felt like saying, "Shouldn't you go home?" but felt that I really couldn't suggest this to him. We proceeded with the morning round until one of the senior nurses turned up. Thankfully, she convinced him to go home, found a replacement for afternoon clinic, and that was that. Nevertheless, his behaviour had an effect on me. Medical students starting work on the wards work out what their place is by looking at those around them. Medical students are, by nature, diligent. In order to feel less out of place, we emulate the doctors we aspire to be and take on their traits. This is true for both positive and negative behaviours, and is an important reason as to why culture is so hard to change. When you refuse to take a sick day, despite being obviously unwell, we think it's all right to do the same. When you neglect your family or demand us to be there hours longer than our university designates, we absorb that too. A sponge has no filter. It absorbs everything. Perhaps our seniors underestimate the depth of this influence, and the cycle continues when we ourselves forget that we become teachers too. Depending on how people work within them, hierarchies in medicine can be a tool for good or perpetuate unhealthy cultures. When reasonable Socratic questioning becomes teaching by humiliation, the power differential is exploited. Our concept of professionalism comes directly from our seniors. It's not something that can be taught didactically. Every single medical professional has the power to change the culture of medicine, merely by looking at how you yourselves act. Much of this comes back to the concept of mentoring. It's vital and often accidental. In a lot of ways, I consider some of the greatest influences I've had as coming from those in the medical profession who show how they care. In my rural term, the influence and care I saw in my doctor's practice was truly inspiring. It went beyond his clinical practice and influences the way that I see doctors helping our community. Now, not all of us are lucky to have such a humbling experience. In fact, the variation in clinical experience continues to be a concern for students. Some of us are bullied, some harassed, and for some, ambition overwhelms the desire to care for patients. With the pace of change accelerating, doctors with a worldview that extends beyond the scope of clinical medicine are needed now more than ever. The AMA is the natural home for these doctors, and its work in facilitating student and junior doctor engagement is absolutely invaluable. I'd like to thank the AMA for its continued support of AMSA and the future of the medical profession. There are many challenges that face our profession and the health of our nation, and it gives me great hope to be part of an organisation that addresses them. Thank you.
Well, the address from the AMSA President is always a highlight of National Conference, and again this year, Rob, thank you for a thoughtful and thought-provoking address. We're now adjourning for morning tea. Please, while you're out there, sign up for the breakfast meetings with topic experts tomorrow morning. There's a range of them. They've very distinguished people who've devoted their time to our sessions tomorrow morning. See what's available and please take up that opportunity. See you back here in 20 minutes. Thank you.